We've all heard the stories, the romantic tales of Viking warriors returning from conquest, bringing beautiful foreign brides to share in their glory and wealth. Hollywood shows us torch-lit wedding feasts, mead flowing like rivers, warriors celebrating their victories with their new wives dancing beside them in halls filled with laughter and song. The popular imagination paints these war brides as exotic prizes who found new lives of honor and prosperity in the great halls of the North. We see them portrayed as willing participants in grand love stories, women who chose adventure over safety, passion over security. But what actually happened when the feast ended? When the last horn of mead was drained? When the final song was sung? When the wedding guests departed and the great hall fell silent? What was the reality for these women when the doors closed behind them and they found themselves alone with their new husbands in a foreign land, surrounded by a culture that had very specific and horrifying plans for their future? The archaeological evidence, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts reveal a truth so systematic and brutal that it challenges everything we think we know about Viking society. These weren't love stories. They weren't even marriages in any sense we would recognize. They were the final phase of a sophisticated program of psychological destruction designed to break the spirits of captured women and transform them into breeding machines for an expanding empire. The reality that emerges from the evidence is that the feast itself was a carefully orchestrated ritual of humiliation disguised as celebration. Every element, from the food served to the songs sung to the ceremonial clothing, was designed to strip away the last vestiges of the women's former identity and prepare them for a life of systematic brutalization that would make their previous captivity seem merciful by comparison. This isn't historical speculation or feminist interpretation of ambiguous sources. What we're about to uncover is documented in excruciating detail in legal codes, preserved in archaeological remains, and recorded by eyewitnesses who watched these rituals unfold. The evidence comes from multiple independent sources spanning 3 centuries and covering territories from Ireland to Russia, from Scotland to Constantinople. The pattern is consistent, the documentation is overwhelming, and the systematic nature of the brutality is undeniable. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is how an entire civilization developed such sophisticated methods for the complete psychological and physical destruction of human beings under the guise of marriage and celebration. How did wedding feasts become torture rituals? How did marriage ceremonies become elaborate psychological warfare designed to destroy a woman's sense of self? How did Norse society create legal frameworks that made systematic brutalization not just permissible, but mandatory? The evidence begins with the archaeological record from sites across Scandinavia, where excavations have revealed the physical remains of what chroniclers euphemistically called wedding preparations. At Birka in Sweden, archaeologists have uncovered specialized chambers beneath the Great Hall that were specifically designed for holding captive women during the pre-feast preparation period. These chambers, dating from the 9th through 11th centuries, contain iron rings set into the walls at precise intervals, drainage systems designed to handle large quantities of water and other fluids, and tool marks on the walls, consistent with systematic torture. The most revealing discoveries come from the sites of former great halls in Norway and Denmark, where ground-penetrating radar has revealed underground complexes that were connected to the main feast halls by hidden passages. Chemical analysis of soil samples from these chambers reveals high concentrations of human blood, urine, and other bodily fluids, along with traces of exotic spices and perfumes that isotope analysis indicates were imported from the captives' homelands. The combination suggests these spaces were used for systematic abuse, disguised as purification rituals. At Lejre in Denmark, the site of the legendary halls described in Beowulf, excavations have revealed a complex of underground chambers that could accommodate dozens of women simultaneously. The layout reveals a systematic progression from holding cells to preparation areas to what appear to be ceremonial chambers, where the actual marriage feast preparations took place. Skeletal remains found in these chambers show evidence of prolonged torture, systematic mutilation, and eventual execution for those who proved unsuitable for the feast. The written evidence is even more damning. The most comprehensive documentation comes from the Skalholt Laws, a collection of Icelandic legal codes that explicitly outline the procedures for conducting what they term conquest marriages. These laws, preserved in multiple manuscripts dating from the 10th through 12th centuries, provide step-by-step instructions for every aspect of the process, from the initial selection of suitable captives to the specific rituals that were to be performed before, during, and after the feast. The Skalholt laws define war brides as captive women who had been selected for matrimonial exploitation based on specific criteria. They must be of proven fertility, demonstrable noble or wealthy background, and capable of producing children who could claim inheritance rights in their homeland. The laws specify that these women were to be subjected to a preparation period of exactly 40 days, during which they would undergo systematic psychological conditioning, designed to break their resistance and prepare them for their role as breeding wives. Contemporary chroniclers provide first-hand accounts of these feast rituals that are almost impossible to read without horror. The monk Rembert, writing in the 9th century, describes attending what he initially believed was a traditional Norse wedding feast, only to realize he was witnessing something far more sinister. His account, preserved in the Vita and Skari, describes the systematic humiliation of captive women who were forced to participate in elaborate ceremonies designed to celebrate their own destruction. Even more detailed are the accounts of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who traveled extensively through Viking territories in the 10th century. His observations of marriage feasts provide precise documentation of the rituals involved, including the systematic drugging of the captive brides with hallucinogenic substances, the ritualized destruction of any remaining possessions from their homeland, and the elaborate ceremonies in which they were forced to publicly renounce their former names, families, and religious beliefs. The Byzantine chronicler Constantine Porphyrogenitus provides accounts from the eastern trade routes where Viking merchants would sell used war brides who had survived the feast process but were no longer considered suitable for breeding purposes. His descriptions of these women, broken, scarred, and psychologically destroyed, provide clear evidence of what the feast ritual actually accomplished. But perhaps most chilling are the saga accounts written by the Vikings themselves. The Laxdæla saga, the Egil saga, and the Volsunga saga all contain detailed descriptions of marriage feasts that, when read with an understanding of the legal and social context, become instruction manuals for systematic psychological and physical torture. The sagas describe these rituals with pride, viewing them as demonstrations of Viking superiority and sophisticated cultural practices. The feast itself was the culmination of the 40-day preparation period, and archaeological evidence reveals the elaborate infrastructure that supported these events. At major sites like Uppsala and Gamla Uppsala in Sweden, excavations have revealed feast halls capable of accommodating hundreds of guests, with specialized areas for different aspects of the ritual. The halls included elevated platforms where the captive brides were displayed, underground chambers where the pre-feast preparations took place, and specialized cooking areas where the feast foods were prepared, using recipes that incorporated psychoactive substances. Chemical analysis of pottery fragments from these feast halls reveals traces of ergot, a hallucinogenic fungus, along with imported opium and other mind-altering substances. The concentrations suggest these drugs were administered in carefully calculated doses, designed to keep the captive brides conscious and aware, but unable to resist or fully comprehend what was happening to them. The combination of substances created a state of compliant terror that made the victims appear to be willing participants in their own destruction. The legal codes provide detailed instructions for the feast ceremony itself, revealing the systematic nature of every element. The Graga specifies that the captive bride must be dressed in clothing made from fabric taken from her homeland, but modified with Norse symbols and colors that demonstrated her new status. She was to be adorned with jewelry that incorporated elements from her former life, family rings, religious symbols, precious stones, but these items were to be melted down and reformed into Norse designs, symbolically destroying her past while incorporating its value into her new identity. The feast menu was carefully planned to include foods from the captive's homeland, but prepared in ways that violated her cultural and religious traditions. Christian captives were forced to consume foods prepared in violation of their religious laws. Muslim captives were forced to consume pork and alcohol. Jewish captives were subjected to elaborate violations of kosher dietary laws. The goal was to force them to participate in the systematic destruction of everything they had once held sacred. If you value this kind of deep dive documented history, hit that subscribe button. It's the single best way to keep this channel going. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The psychological warfare began long before the actual feast. The 40-day preparation period was designed as a systematic program of identity destruction that would leave the captive completely dependent on her captors for any sense of self-worth or purpose. The legal codes describe this process in clinical detail, providing instructions that read like a modern manual on psychological torture and mind control. The first phase involved what the laws called name death, the complete erasure of the captive's former identity. She was forbidden from speaking her real name, mentioning her family, or referencing any aspect of her former life. Violation of this rule resulted in increasingly severe punishments that escalated until compliance was achieved. The captive was assigned a new name, typically one that referenced her intended function or her captor's perception of her value: gold hair, silk skin, breed well, or simply property. The second phase involved systematic sensory manipulation designed to disorient and break down psychological resistance. The captive was kept in underground chambers where day and night became indistinguishable. She was alternately subjected to complete silence and overwhelming noise, including the sounds of other captives being tortured, the screams of those who resisted, and detailed descriptions of what awaited her if she failed to comply with her captor's demands. The third phase involved what the legal codes euphemistically termed cultural preparation. The captive was forced to learn Norse customs, language, and religious practices while being systematically punished for any display of knowledge about her own culture. She was required to memorize detailed accounts of Norse superiority and her own people's supposed inferiority, and to recite these accounts on command. Failure to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for her new culture resulted in severe physical punishment. The fourth and final phase involved what the chronicles describe as marital preparation, a systematic program of sexual abuse designed to break down any remaining psychological resistance and prepare the captive for her role as a breeding wife. The legal codes specify that this preparation was to be conducted by multiple men, ensuring that the captive understood her complete powerlessness and the futility of resistance. Throughout this 40-day period, the captive was given just enough food to maintain her physical health while being systematically deprived of sleep, comfort, and human dignity. She was kept naked except during specific ritual activities, housed in conditions designed to be deeply uncomfortable without causing permanent physical damage, and subjected to regular medical examinations to ensure her continued fertility and market value. The archaeological evidence supports these written accounts with horrifying precision. Excavations at sites like Hedeby and Kaupang have revealed the specialized chambers where this preparation took place. The rooms were designed with sophisticated ventilation systems that could introduce various scents and airborne substances, drainage systems that could flood the chambers with cold water at will, and acoustic properties that could amplify sounds to create disorienting echoes or complete silence. Chemical analysis of the chamber walls reveals traces of various substances used to induce psychological distress: rotting organic matter to create nauseating odors, burning materials that would fill the chambers with smoke, and exotic perfumes that would trigger memories of home before being replaced with the smell of decay. The systematic use of sensory manipulation reveals a sophisticated understanding of psychological torture that rivals modern techniques. The feast itself typically lasted 3 days and 3 nights, with each day focusing on a different aspect of the captive's transformation. The legal codes specify that the first day was devoted to the death of the old self, with elaborate rituals designed to symbolically destroy everything the captive had once been. The second day focused on the birth of the new self, with ceremonies that established her new identity as property. The third day celebrated the consummation of ownership, with the actual marriage ceremony that legally transferred the captive to her new owner. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale and complexity of these events. At major sites, the feast halls could accommodate 300, 500 guests, with elaborate seating arrangements that placed the captive bride on display while surrounding her with reminders of her powerlessness. The halls included raised platforms where the captive would be exhibited to the assembled guests, underground chambers where she could be taken for private humiliation, and specialized areas where various torture implements were displayed as reminders of the consequences of resistance. The first day's rituals, documented in detail in the saga literature, involve the systematic destruction of everything from the captive's former life. Any remaining possessions, clothing, jewelry, religious items, personal mementos, were brought out and destroyed in elaborate ceremonies. The captive was forced to participate in these destructions, often being required to personally burn items that held sacred or sentimental value. The destruction was accompanied by detailed recitations of why these items represented inferior culture and why their destruction was beneficial to the captive. The feast foods on the first day were specifically chosen to force cultural and religious violations. Captive Christian nuns were forced to consume foods prepared in mock communion ceremonies that blasphemed their religious beliefs. Muslim captives were presented with elaborate pork dishes prepared with wine and served during prayer times. Jewish captives were forced to consume combinations of foods that violated every aspect of kosher dietary laws. The goal was to force the captive to participate in the destruction of her own religious and cultural foundations. The entertainment on the first day consisted of elaborate performances that mocked the captive's homeland and culture. Saga accounts describe detailed theatrical presentations that portrayed the captive's people as inferior, cowardly, and deserving of conquest. The captive was required to applaud these performances and to express agreement with their messages. Failure to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm resulted in immediate punishment, administered in front of the assembled guests. The second day focused on establishing the captive's new identity as property. The ceremonies began with the formal assignment of her new name, accompanied by rituals that symbolically branded her as owned goods. Archaeological evidence includes specialized branding irons found at feast sites, designed to create permanent marks that identified the captive's owner and her intended function. The branding was performed as part of the feast entertainment, with the captive's screams providing amusement for the assembled guests. The legal codes specify that the captive was to be dressed in clothing that clearly marked her status as property, while incorporating elements that mocked her former rank and culture. If she had been a nun, she might be dressed in a perverted version of religious garments. If she had been a noblewoman, she might wear a crown made from the melted down jewelry of her murdered family members. The clothing was designed to be both humiliating and arousing, emphasizing her role as a sexual commodity. The second day's entertainment involved elaborate displays of the captive's submission and obedience. She was required to perform various degrading acts for the amusement of the guests, crawling on hands and knees, begging for food like an animal, performing sexual acts with objects or animals, and demonstrating her willingness to serve any guest's desires. These performances were interspersed with educational presentations, where Norse men explained to the assembled guests the proper methods for training and maintaining captive wives. The feast foods on the second day were designed to be physically and psychologically overwhelming. The legal codes describe elaborate multi-course meals that included dozens of different dishes, many prepared with mind-altering substances that would keep the captive conscious but compliant. She was required to consume specific quantities of each dish while performing various submissive behaviors for the entertainment of the guests. Failure to consume the required amounts or to perform the required behaviors resulted in immediate physical punishment. The third day culminated in the actual marriage ceremony, but this bore no resemblance to any traditional understanding of matrimony. The ceremony was designed as a public demonstration of ownership, with elaborate rituals that legally transferred the captive from the collective ownership of the raiding party to the individual ownership of her designated husband. The legal codes specify that this transfer was to be accompanied by detailed negotiations over the captive's value, breeding potential, and expected productivity. The marriage vows, preserved in multiple legal documents, required the captive to formally renounce any claim to her former identity, to acknowledge herself as property, and to swear absolute obedience to her new owner. She was required to request specific forms of punishment for any future disobedience, and to thank her captors for providing her with the opportunity to serve Norse superiority. The vows were administered while she was subjected to various forms of physical abuse, ensuring that they were associated with pain and terror. The wedding night was the culmination of the entire 43-day process of systematic destruction. The legal codes provide explicit instructions for this final stage of the captive's transformation, specifying that it was to be conducted as a public demonstration of her complete submission. The chamber was to be equipped with various torture implements, and the assembled guests were to witness the bride's complete surrender to her new role as breeding property. Archaeological evidence from wedding chambers reveals the infrastructure that supported these events. The rooms were equipped with iron restraints set into the walls and floors, specialized furniture designed to facilitate various forms of abuse, and viewing areas where guests could observe the proceedings. The chambers included medical supplies for treating injuries that might interfere with the captive's breeding function, but no provisions for comfort or dignity. The systematic nature of the abuse is documented in legal codes that specify minimum requirements for the wedding night activities. The captive was to be subjected to specific forms of violence designed to demonstrate her powerlessness, required to perform specific acts of submission for the entertainment of witnesses, and forced to express gratitude for her treatment. The legal codes specify that these requirements were not optional. Failure to meet them would result in the marriage being declared invalid and the captive being returned to collective ownership for disposal. The aftermath of the feast revealed the true purpose of the entire elaborate ritual: the complete transformation of human beings into breeding animals. The legal codes specify that successful war brides were expected to produce children at regular intervals, with detailed regulations governing their treatment during pregnancy, childbirth, and child rearing. The children born to these captives were considered valuable property, with their potential uses planned from birth. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized facilities for housing pregnant war brides, designed to maximize successful births while maintaining the mother's complete subjugation. These facilities included medical areas staffed by skilled midwives, nurseries organized according to the perceived value of the children, and training areas where young children were taught their designated roles in Norse society. The facilities were designed as much like prisons as hospitals, with extensive security measures to prevent escape attempts. The legal framework governing war brides after the feast was remarkably detailed and comprehensive. The Gragas contains extensive sections devoted to the management of breeding wives, including specific instructions for maintaining their health while ensuring their continued submission. The laws specify feeding schedules designed to optimize fertility, exercise regimens that would maintain physical condition without building strength, and psychological conditioning programs designed to prevent the development of maternal bonds that might interfere with the efficient management of their children. The documentation reveals that children born to war brides were considered valuable assets with predetermined purposes. Boys would be raised as warriors or administrators, with their maternal heritage potentially useful for future conquest and governance of their mother's homelands. Girls would be raised as the next generation of war brides, with their mixed heritage making them valuable commodities in international slave markets. The systematic planning for these children's futures began before their birth and continued throughout their upbringing. The international scope of the war bride system reveals its true scale and sophisticated organization. Archaeological evidence traces the movement of captive women from across Europe to feast sites throughout Scandinavia. With established routes, standardized procedures, and regular shipping schedules, the system operated with the efficiency of a modern international corporation, complete with quality control standards, customer service protocols, and performance metrics. The economic records preserved in various legal documents reveal the enormous profitability of the war bride system. A single successful breeding wife could produce a dozen or more children over her reproductive lifetime, each of whom had specific economic value. The initial investment in capturing, transporting, and processing a war bride could be recovered within a few years, with decades of additional profit from her offspring. The return on investment made war bride acquisition one of the most profitable activities in Viking society. The specialized markets for war bride children reveal the sophisticated economic planning behind the entire system. Archaeological evidence includes what appear to be catalogs or price lists for different categories of half Viking children, with premium pricing for those whose mothers came from specific regions or social classes. Children whose mothers had been European royalty commanded the highest prices, followed by those from wealthy merchant families, with the offspring of common captives at the bottom of the pricing structure. The geographic distribution of war bride facilities reveals the continental scope of the operation. Archaeological sites with evidence of war bride processing have been identified from Ireland to Russia, from Scotland to the Black Sea. The consistency of the facility designs, legal frameworks, and operational procedures suggests centralized planning and standardized training for the personnel involved in managing the system. The training programs for men involved in managing war brides were sophisticated and comprehensive. Legal documents describe specialized schools where young Norsemen learned the techniques of psychological manipulation, breeding management, and human trafficking. These schools provided detailed instruction in the identification of suitable captives, the methods for breaking psychological resistance, and the ongoing management of breeding wives and their offspring. The infrastructure supporting the war bride system included specialized transportation networks designed for moving human cargo efficiently and securely. Archaeological evidence reveals purpose-built vessels, with dedicated holding areas for captive women, way stations where they could be processed and redistributed, and communication systems that allowed for the coordination of capture and delivery schedules across vast distances. The medical aspects of the war bride system reveal a sophisticated understanding of human biology applied for purely exploitative purposes. Legal documents describe detailed protocols for maintaining the health and fertility of captive women, including specialized diets, exercise regimens, and medical treatments designed to maximize their reproductive potential. The same documents specify that medical care was to be limited to interventions that maintained economic value, with no provisions for comfort, pain relief, or psychological support. The systematic breeding programs produced detailed genealogical records that tracked bloodlines across multiple generations. Archaeological evidence includes what appear to be breeding charts that documented the parentage, characteristics, and intended uses of children born to war brides. These records reveal long-term strategic planning that spanned decades, with specific breeding combinations designed to produce children with desired characteristics for various purposes. The resistance efforts by war brides, though systematically suppressed, left traces in the archaeological record that reveal their courage and determination. Hidden caches of personal items, secret communication systems, and evidence of attempted escapes demonstrate that even under the most brutal conditions, some women never stopped fighting for their freedom and dignity. The systematic efforts to prevent and punish resistance reveal how significant a threat these women posed to their captors' control. The psychological techniques used to maintain control over war brides were remarkably sophisticated and reveal a deep understanding of human psychology applied for purely malicious purposes. Legal documents describe methods of conditioning that would be recognizable to modern experts on trauma and mind control: systematic isolation, alternating punishment and reward, the destruction of hope, and the creation of learned helplessness. These techniques were refined over generations of practice and became increasingly effective at producing compliant victims. The cultural impact of the war bride system extended far beyond its immediate victims. The systematic capture and brutalization of women from across Europe contributed to the destabilization of entire regions, the breakdown of traditional family structures, and the creation of international networks of human trafficking that persisted long after the Viking period ended. The legal frameworks developed for managing war brides influenced slavery laws across medieval Europe and provided templates for systematic oppression that were adapted for use against other vulnerable populations. The end of the war bride system came not through moral awakening or successful resistance, but through economic and political changes that made it less profitable and sustainable. The consolidation of European kingdoms under stronger central authorities made large-scale raiding more difficult. The Christianization of Scandinavia created new legal restrictions on the treatment of baptized captives. The development of alternative sources of wealth reduced the economic importance of human trafficking. But, perhaps most importantly, the system began to face internal resistance from within Norse society itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the late Viking period, some Norse women were organizing resistance efforts to protect potential captives and assist escaped war brides. Legal documents from the period reveal increasing restrictions on the war bride system and growing legal protections for women within Norse society, suggesting that the systematic brutalization of foreign women was beginning to threaten the stability of Norse family structures. The most chilling revelation in the entire historical record comes from the latest archaeological discoveries, which reveal that as foreign sources of war brides became scarce, the system began to turn inward. Skeletal remains from 11th and 12th century sites show evidence that the same techniques perfected for processing foreign captives were being applied to Norse women whose families had fallen out of political favor, or who had been designated as politically inconvenient. The legal frameworks that had been developed for managing foreign war brides were adapted to deal with domestic political problems. The feast rituals that had been designed to break foreign women were applied to Norse women whose marriages needed to be dissolved for political reasons, or whose independence posed threats to male authority. The breeding programs that had been designed to produce half-Viking children with claims to foreign territories were turned inward to eliminate inconvenient bloodlines within Norse society. Archaeological evidence suggests that the infrastructure built for processing foreign war brides was increasingly used for managing domestic women who had violated social expectations or challenged male authority. The same underground chambers that had housed captured Irish and English women were filled with Norse women, whose only crimes were attempting to inherit property, refusing arranged marriages, or expressing opinions that challenged established authority. The systematic techniques that had been refined through centuries of practice on foreign victims proved equally effective when applied to domestic targets. The psychological conditioning programs that had broken the spirits of foreign queens and princesses were used to control Norse women who attempted to exercise traditional feminine authority. The breeding management systems that had maximized the reproductive potential of foreign captives were applied to Norse wives, whose fertility was considered politically or economically important. The transformation was so complete that by the end of the Viking period, the distinction between foreign war brides and domestic wives had largely disappeared. The legal codes that governed both groups became increasingly similar. The facilities that housed them were integrated, and the techniques used to control them became standardized regardless of their origins. The system that had begun as a method for exploiting foreign enemies had become a comprehensive program for controlling all women within Norse society. The final archaeological evidence reveals the ultimate fate of the war bride system. It consumed the very society that had created it. Skeletal remains from the latest Viking period sites show that the techniques perfected for breaking foreign women were eventually applied to the daughters and wives of the Norse elite who had originally designed the system. The great halls that had hosted marriage feasts for foreign captives became venues for similar rituals, involving Norse women whose families had lost political power or whose independence had become inconvenient. The legal documents from the final period of the war bride system reveal its complete transformation into a tool of domestic oppression. The laws that had once distinguished between foreign captives and Norse wives were eliminated, replaced by comprehensive regulations that treated all women as potential threats requiring systematic control. The feast rituals that had once celebrated victory over foreign enemies became regular ceremonies for maintaining domestic authority and eliminating female independence. The breeding programs that had once been designed to produce children with claims to foreign territories were redirected toward eliminating inconvenient bloodlines and ensuring political loyalty within Norse society. The specialized facilities that had once housed foreign captives were filled with Norse women whose only crimes were being born into families that had become politically problematic or expressing ideas that challenged established masculine authority. This is the true horror of the war bride system. It wasn't just a method for exploiting foreign enemies, but a comprehensive program for destroying feminine independence and reducing all women to breeding property. The archaeological evidence, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts reveal a system that became so efficient and comprehensive that it eventually consumed the very society that created it. The women who died in Viking marriage feasts weren't just victims of historical brutality. They were the casualties of a system that ultimately proved no respecter of nationality, class, or family loyalty when masculine power and control were at stake. The horrors they faced after the feasts ended were beyond imagination, not just because of their systematic cruelty, but because they revealed how efficiently human societies can develop techniques for destroying human dignity, and how inevitably such techniques spread from their intended targets to consume entire civilizations. In the end, the untold story of war brides after Viking feasts breaks our hearts because it demonstrates that the greatest threat to human dignity often comes not from foreign enemies, but from the systematic techniques societies develop to control and exploit the vulnerable members of their own communities. The feast halls that echoed with celebration became chambers of systematic torture, and the marriage ceremonies that should have represented new beginnings became elaborate rituals for the complete destruction of human identity and worth.